With conflict escalating around the world on almost a daily basis now, I thought it'd be a good idea to go back into history and examine how everyday American citizens prepared for war in the lead up to World War II. And a lot of this video is going to focus on the Office of Civilian Defense, which was actually created in 1941 by President at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So we're going to talk about what they did and what volunteers around the country participated in order to give you an idea of what we probably need to get ready for in case of this World War III scenario reaching us here at home. Because the Office of Civilian Defense was specifically created with the idea that something could happen here. Now, if you've ever gotten anything from Midway USA because you're paranoid about what could happen in the future and maybe 8mm Mauser was in your cart at some point in time, then hit the subscribe button below because they're the biggest supporter of the channel, and thanks to them I can provide videos like this to you while also hopefully getting you better prepared. So big thanks to Midway USA. Now, like I said, the Office of Civilian Defense was established by Franklin Delano Roosevelt on May 20th, 1941, which was months before the US actually entered World War II. And the goal was to coordinate federal civilian defense activities with support from state and local governments. And there was actually 9 regional civilian defense areas created that had offices established around the country. Now, part of the plan was to establish local defense councils where they created plans to protect life and property in the event that an emergency happened here on American soil. And they recruited auxiliaries to help out because they needed volunteers, since either everyone else was in the war or on their way to war or working in the industrial effort to support the war. Now, within a year of the creation of the Office of Civilian Defense, there was over 8,000 defense councils established around the country with over 5 million volunteers. And by the end of the war, there was 12 million volunteers involved. So that concerns me a little bit because I don't know if we could find 12 million Americans that would actually be willing to sacrifice their time, energy, and effort to help each other out at this point in time. But hopefully you're one of those Americans, which I greatly appreciate. Now, the biggest concern for why this entity was created was because of the idea of sabotage and surprise attack occurring here in the US. And this was before Pearl Harbor. But once Pearl Harbor happened, it reinforced the concept for why this was a necessity. So, be aware that during World War II and the lead up to it, for the United States at least, our country was preparing citizens here in the country for bad things to happen at home. We're really not seeing that right now here in 2024. But this is what happened back then. That's why we're analyzing it right this second. Now, the first job of the Office of Civilian Defense was to identify potential targets. So they pointed out weak spots within our infrastructure in order to give communities an idea of what was most likely to be targeted. And that's something that you should definitely be considering right now. I think our community here knows what a lot of these targets would be in this current point in time, but back then the government was actually telling neighborhoods around the country what to expect. After that, they started to tap on volunteers based on their skills and their availabilities, and they got them to perform certain tasks. So this is what Americans were really doing to prepare for war here on American soil during World War II. And I think that this is very interesting and something you should definitely consider when it comes to your personal skill sets, as well as what to expect here in the future if things escalate even further and we, of course, see anything happen here at home. Here's what they started doing. Doctors and nurses taught first aid courses to their local communities in order to help during an emergency, right? Retired people studied shapes and symbols of enemy aircraft while watching the skies, so that they could identify if an air raid was about to occur. Women organized morale-boosting events such as dances, games, and they even offered sewing services to U.S. servicemen who needed help with their uniforms. Farmers helped people grow victory gardens. They taught people the way of gardening and how the seasons worked, and they tried to get their communities involved in growing their own food. Block leaders, which is what this title was called back then, provided information from the Defense Council to their communities or their neighborhoods. So they would get the information received from what's happening on the defensive side and then bring it on down to their local community so everybody was on the same page and aware of the current risk level. Volunteer boards were posted to help with the tasks. So you would see these volunteer boards at a community center in your area that would tell you that these different jobs were needed and that you could sign up for them right then and there. They also had schools compete for scrap and grease collection, right? So the kids would go out, they'd collect a bunch of aluminum or metal scrap, and then they would go get grease from restaurants because that could be converted into nitroglycerin and all types of other things. And these schools would have actual competitions to see who could get the most in order to incentivize the kids to help out. Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts alike actually sold war bonds and stamps at the time in order to help boost the economy while also boosting the war effort from much needed funding, right? Volunteers were also requested for decontamination squads, where they would go out and learn how to decon an area in case of a chemical attack. And the same could be said for road service squads, who were also required in order to keep the roads functional if a bombing blitz were to happen, and it would shut down transportation unless the roads were back up and running quickly. We also had childcare as a main focus during this time, where we had something called war nurseries, which were set up where volunteers would come in and help watch the children of their community, because many of the men were either going to be helping in different parts of the community or being drafted into war, and the women who were left behind often went and got jobs as well at the factories. So there wasn't very many childcare options. So at the time, the federal government actually funded childcare and used these war nurseries in order to get the kids safe and somewhere where they could learn while their parents were working or fighting the war. Civil Air Patrol was another huge initiative of the Office of Civilian Defense. And the Civil Air Patrol was civilian pilots who would go out and search the coast for submarine activity and report back, or they would even escort merchant ships in order to make sure that there was some safe way of navigation. So Civil Air Patrol was huge in making sure that our coastlines were much safer when the Army was too busy making sure that the war was being properly won. We also had fire watchers and volunteer firefighters. And in fact, in general, most emergency services were taken over by volunteer units to some degree, because a lot of the able-bodied men who would usually have been the police or the firefighters or whatever other emergency service of the area were sent off to war. And one of the biggest ones, and one of the people who got the most notoriety within their communities, were actually air raid wardens. Now, air raid wardens would go out and educate their neighbors about possible electricity blackouts. They would talk about what to do in that event. They would also inform them of what to do during an air raid. And then they would patrol the streets of their community, especially at night, ensuring that they weren't making themselves an obvious target. And some of those things that they were looking for was people leaving their lights on unnecessarily, or people being too obnoxiously loud and vibrant, which would create a reason for someone to target their location. And in order to protect their community, at some points in time, these air raid wardens would even do stuff as far as shooting out someone's lights in order to make sure that they weren't becoming a target by leaving them on unnecessarily. So these are all things that everyday American citizens volunteered for and started doing before we even entered the war, and they became even more of a necessity once we did enter the war in December of 1941. But like I said, the Office of Civilian Defense was actually established May 20th, 1941. So that's almost 7 months before we entered World War II, which should tell you that there's a lot of preparation required in order to afford ourselves the time we need to get ready for an attack on American soil or for a World War III type scenario. So I wanted to bring this to your attention because I thought this information was relevant, I thought it was interesting, and I also find it concerning that our current government and our current, let's just say, civil defense programs that don't really exist anymore aren't doing much to prepare us for anything happening here in the near future. And unfortunately, at least in my opinion, the way it looks is that there's a likelihood of something happening here in the near future. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and add anything I missed in the comments as well, because there's a lot of different things that were happening during that time that I didn't explain in this video that also relate to the Office of Civilian Defense. And if you have anyone in your family or you yourself had personal experience with some of that, let us know, because it could give us some ideas about what we should be preparing for ourselves. Anything else you need from me at all, go to magicprepper.com. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.